Britain as an island, of course, was threatened during the war by German U-boats, which were predating on our food supplies coming in and oil supplies and military supplies and the convoys coming across the Atlantic. So I grew up being very, very conscious of the U-boat threat to the country. While I was at school, the Americans came out with this world-shattering development, USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. And then while I was still at school, Nautilus traveled from the Pacific to the Atlantic by traveling under the Arctic ice cap. I mean, no one apart from the handful of people in the Nautilus operational program would have even thought that was possible. And so Britain then had decided to follow suit, and I think we paid the Americans for a little bit of help to rapidly develop nuclear submarines of our own. And it seemed to me then that nuclear submarines were the things best equipped to deal with U-boats. And then when I was in the Navy as a midshipman out in the Far East in a destroyer, we did anti-submarine exercises. And every time the submarine was able to fire its green grenade saying it torpedoed us, and we still didn't have contact on it, because in warmer waters, you get a layer of warmer water on the surface, and it acts like a sound duct, you know. And a ship sitting on top of that floating, it's hearing the sound in this top sound duct. But if the submarine ducks under the so-called layer, it can't hear it. And I thought, well, the answer to defending Britain as an island against submarine threat is to have a nuclear-powered submarine which has got limitless fuel, relatively speaking, and it can duck down to where the submarines operate. And so our first submarines were called hunter-killer submarines. You call them attack boats, but our submarines, British submarines, nuclear submarines, are primarily to attack Soviet submarines, not so much surface ships, although ironically in the Falklands War, we went down to the other end of the world and sank a cruiser with Second World War torpedoes.
Yeah, and you say in your memoir, if I remember correctly, the sinking of the Belgrano, is that the first ship sunk by a nuclear powered sub?
Yeah, it's the only one sunk by a nuclear-powered sub so far in history.
You touched on this briefly, but I wonder if you could just address it a bit more. What is the significance of nuclear power in a submarine? So you've got the diesel subs, but then there's the change to nuclear powered subs. What is the significance of that? Why is that important?
Well, it's a massive difference. I mean, take the Falklands War. We had something like, I think, at one point we'd actually had 4 nuclear-powered submarines down there. And they got down there, I'm not sure exactly what the passage time was. It was about, I think it's about 10,000 miles or something to go down there from the UK. And they were down there within a week to 10 days. We also sent down a diesel submarine. The reason being that diesel submarines can operate much closer inshore, and that's helpful for landing special forces. Nuclear submarines can't go quite so close inshore for a number of reasons. But it took the diesel submarine something like 2 months to get down there, because a diesel submarine would do its long distance transit on the surface, and then it's got the same problem as all surface ships. It's got to deal with foul weather, and of course the South Atlantic's appalling weather. Whereas the nuclear's 400 feet down, they don't worry about waves. And even if the diesel submarines dive and snorkel, you know, you can only do about 6 knots while you're snorting. I don't think the Argentinians were a particular threat against us sending diesel submarines down with the periscopes up until they got right into the sort of war zone. But it's not, it just take ages. I mean, there's just really no comparison.
And the diesels, like the surface ships, they have to take on fuel, right, to keep going, whereas the nuclear
Yeah,
power can just go
absolutely.
and go and go.
One of the reasons that Britain was able to go back and retake the Falklands was we're still we're still just about large enough to run a logistics supply chain. We had, fleet tankers, fleet warships, fleet ammunition ships. So we could support a surface naval force at the other end of the world. I'm not sure we could do it today, but we could then.
So the
Uh,
nuclear subs can get from Britain to the Falklands much quicker,
oh,
and
absolutely.
they don't need to worry about refueling because the nuclear power just goes
No,
on and
not
on.
at all. No.
Yeah. A question I'm always interested in when I talk to um, veterans who served aboard or who served aboard submarines. It has to do with personality traits that make for a successful submariner. Because I'm sure you've heard this many times before, but I've visited a submarine with family, and we're down there for about 5 minutes, and we look at each other and think we would absolutely go crazy on this thing after 2 days, let alone 2 months. But there are people like yourself who are very successful at it. Um, what are the what are the personality traits that make for a successful submariner?
That's quite a difficult question, Preston,
Mm,
because I certainly have experienced interpersonal relationship problems with fellow submariners on patrol, mainly in my first experience at sea, which I describe in the book, when I had a really difficult time in terms of establishing myself as a new guy straight out of training school. Um, I didn't, when I was older, more experienced, and had more confidence, that becomes slightly easier. I say in the book that cheerful, amiable, and sociable are the characteristics of the submariner, and that's true. I mean, you see the lads, they're all sitting in the mess deck, shoulder to shoulder around small tables and things. And you live in this interdependent, very close-knit community. Uh, it, you're constantly, well, the submarine's constantly a living organism, and depending what watchkeeping system you're using, you might be in your bunk, but you're entirely dependent on your fellow submariners to keep you safe while you're in your bunk. And even when you're not in your bunk, they're still required to keep you safe. So you're all interdependent, and you've all been through military training, so you probably start with a slightly different approach from Joe Citizen pulled out of the high street. But that's not to say there aren't that there are disagreements between people. You do get these interpersonal problems, but it's discipline which actually prevents you taking the sort of actions you had in the Mutiny and the Bounty.
mm,
The other thing is, I've written down here, I didn't actually put it down in the book, but I think a submariner has to be, above all, reliable
mm,
and conscientious. So he doesn't just say, oh, I can't be bothered. I'm just not going to go back and finish that job. I'm going to the cinema instead or something. And honest, not so much honest in terms of not stealing. I mean, one of my fellow officers turned out to be a bit of a Walter Mitty, and he was stealing from the rest of us, and he was stealing from the welfare fund and that sort of thing. And he was eventually court-martialed. So but submariners are not a sort of band of saints.
mm,
But you need to be honest, particularly in the nuclear program, because if you do something wrong, you must admit it. You
mm,
know, I'm sorry, sir, I forgot to put that thing on. So, I signed it off and I hadn't checked. If people don't admit that, that can be fatal. You've got to report things which go wrong. And even if you've made the mistake, you've got to report it.
One of the things I'm hearing you say when you're talking about people working in the world of nuclear propulsion is a need for them to be responsible, honest, responsible to do something, honest if it wasn't done correctly, a willingness to take responsibility because this is such a serious and important trade. And I want to ask you just to talk more about that, the demands of working in the field of nuclear propulsion, just little snippets that I've taken from your memoir is, zero tolerance for failure, the need for responsible behavior at all times. You even use the word nuclear ruthlessness, which I think you're getting at, just a ruthless quest to get it absolutely right every single time. What it takes to succeed as a young person in the nuclear propulsion field.
But if I can go back a step, as I said earlier, we basically paid the Americans to give us the pressurized water reactor technology, which you had developed. And your nuclear submarine program was developed by an amazing man called Hyman J. Rickover. You've probably heard of him. You ask anyone of my generation in the US Navy about Rickover, he took no prisoners. He was not prepared to tolerate any failures or weakness in the nuclear program. It was too important. I mean, too important both militarily, but also the cost of a mistake was too important. If you ended up with a reactor meltdown, alongside in the harbor, and then it became a civilian nuclear accident problem. I mean, that in itself could, I don't know about America, but I think if we'd had a nuclear submarine meltdown at Faslane, I think that would have been the end of our nuclear program, because there are so many anti-nuclear people around, amongst politicians as well. So if we came out with some really embarrassing problem like a submarine reactor melting down alongside the jetty at Faslane, which would have led to a mini Chernobyl type national first, certainly hit the local public. I think the British government just closed down our nuclear submarine program, full stop. Don't know if Americans would be so drastic, but basically Rickover knew the consequences of a nuclear accident, and he really introduced a quality assurance system which accepted zero tolerance for failure. And indeed, in a rather tragic way, you might remember, it's way back, I mean, the early 60s, I think, you lost the USS Thresher. Thresher had just come out of an overhaul. This was a test dive after the overhaul. And again, there was a certain amount of pressure to get it to sea. But whereas the reactor systems were quality assured to the limit, the secondary systems were not. They were still using old technology and old quality assurance standards. And in fact, the pressure testing was really to take the submarine down to deep dive depth and see if everything kept the water out, which it failed to do because I think it was some sort of brazed joint in the seawater system ruptured. And then when the water comes in at 1,000 feet, it doesn't drip, it just blasts. It doesn't even blast you away. I mean, it's like an explosion. And it put the ship's electrical systems out of action. And they'd no power. And at 1,000 feet, you can't get up in a nuclear submarine. I mean, blowing the ballast tanks to make you buoyant doesn't have much effect at 1,000 feet. You need power to get you up. They'd lost power. The irony was that the reactor was perfectly safe. It hadn't failed. Systems totally 100% quality assured. It was the rest of the submarine that wasn't up to that standard. We learned a lot from that, of course, as often, you get the martyrs who go and lose their lives, and thereafter, we try to correct against that happening again.
So I'm thinking about the qualities. If we have in front of us 100 young people, and of this group of 100, we need a couple to be in nuclear propulsion. Then the qualities we're looking for, I'm hearing you, and I'm interested in whatever you would add. An ability to pay attention to detail consistently, day
Yeah,
in, day out.
100% reliability. Yeah.
An ability to tolerate repetition, I'm assuming that implies as well.
That is, of course, one of the things you're fighting against, as they say, familiarity breeds contempt.
Mm,
When you're alongside and you're working down in the dirty, sweaty engine room compartments and things like that, and it's late at night and you're tired and you've done this job before, it's so easy to just say, "Oh, I think I'll just go and have a coffee or something."
mm,
Um, it's you've got to be permanently, systematically working to strict rules. I mean, in the nuclear program, both in the nuclear weapons program and nuclear propulsion program, everything is done against documentation. You don't just send a man down there with a bag of tools and say, "See if you can fix that." You have a committee meets, and you discuss what the job is and how it's going to be tackled. And the
mm,
committee is not just, the boss, with the executive powers. It will probably include representatives from the design authority, representatives from the safety department, representatives from the dockyard workers, representatives from the ship's staff, and you go through this and you produce a document which everyone signs up to, and that's got every step that's got to be taken, and each step is then signed off. So it would say take spanner X to nut B and turn it 3 times clockwise. Tick, sign, job logs.
yeah.
Um,
Mm,
but everyone follows that discipline. There should never be an accident. But I told the story in the book of one of my best men. This was when I was a captain, so I wasn't a ship's officer. I was in charge of all the technical work in our submarine base, and we'd happened to have a lot of nuclear work on at that time because there was a generic problem, and all the submarines needed work done in a radioactive environment, which led to all sorts of problems because you can only expose your workforce to a limited amount of radiation per annum. And anyway, one of my guys who turned out to be one of nuclear welders who turned out to be one of the best guys we had, but I didn't really know him. He's just part of the gang who went down reactor compartments. He was doing work on a system which needed to be isolated on the reactor, but there was no isolating valve. And the way we got around that is you do a thing called a freeze seal when you wrap the pipe in liquid nitrogen, which freezes any water in the pipe absolutely solid and acts as a plug. But liquid nitrogen boils off at something like minus 193 degrees, so it's continuously boiling off. And you had to keep filling this liquid nitrogen sort of bath to keep the freeze seal frozen. And there was a young sort of mechanic would be used to do that sentry on the thing. And this experienced welder, who's a really nice guy, said, "You can go and have a coffee or something. I'll fill the tank up when it's necessary." But then he was probably hanging upside down trying to weld a pipe, and he forgot about the thing, and the freeze seal started to melt, which would have been a primary coolant leak, which is that would have been what you call a definitive nuclear accident. Anyway, he kind of realized what he'd done and corrected the problem, put more liquid nitrogen in. And with admirable honesty, he admitted what he'd done. when I heard this, I went ballistic because we had about 6 submarines all with work going on. And I thought, if we've got to the stage when one of my best men relaxes a bit and nearly makes quite a serious mistake, then we're doing too much. We need to stop. And I actually stopped all nuclear work until we sorted what gone sorted out, gone wrong. And of course, I then had the wrath of God breathing down my neck from higher naval authorities who wanted to get these submarines fixed and back to sea. But I had the whip hand in that because I was responsible for nuclear safety, and so I played the red card. It probably didn't win me friends in high places. Anyway, I sent for this guy who I'd never really met, and I was ready to tear him off the strip and tell him that not good enough. This is not how you run nuclear repair. He came into the office. So before he came up to see me, I got his service documents and realized this guy had years and years of really good work behind him. And I thought, actually, this guy needs a medal, not a telling off. So when he came up, I had every intention of giving him the rough end of my tongue. And when he came in, I just congratulated him and I recommended him for a medal, which he got. But that's the exam. Even the best men, and just they can be caught just not, just relaxing.
And I'm sure he had learned the lesson.
Oh yeah,
The walk to your office, I'm sure, was punishment enough.
exactly. Yeah, absolutely, exactly.
We're talking about a job that requires constant attention to detail. There's a degree of tedium involved doing the same thing over and over. And then you're at sea and you have these rotations. 8 hours on duty, 8 hours off duty. In another case I'm aware of, 6 hours on, 18 hours off. So that's pretty nice. Or 12 hours off, I'm sorry. I've heard of 6 hours on, 6 hours off. And so that means that you never get a full sleep. And then I think the rotation I've heard of that is crazier than any that I've heard of before, I think you referred to it, if I read it correctly, 3 hours on, 3 hours off.
Two,
Huh?
2 hours on, 4 hours off.
Oh, 2 hours on, 4 hours off.
Yeah.
But that still means that you never really get full sleep. How can you maintain a high level of performance in that kind of environment? Or has the Navy by now said those kind of rotations just don't work? Or, where do things stand with that?
Well, again, there's multiple answers to that. We did the 2 on 4 off in diesel submarines because we only had 6 officers. And I think if it'd been 4 hours on and 8 hours off, I don't think that would have worked very well. Whereas in the nuclear boats today, and I'm talking about British boats, I don't know what the Americans do. They have what they call a 2-watch system. I think you're 12 on and 12 off, something like that. Half the crew always up, half the crew on call, which is what used to be called relaxed action stations during the war. But I don't fancy that at all. We also had in the nuclear boats, there's a different regime for the engineers back aft running the propulsion plant from what we called the seaman officers, the combat officers forward. The engineers, we ran 4-hour watches and we were 1 in 4. So around the day, that'd be 6 watches, wouldn't it? And then we have the 2 half watches to split, so that you don't have repetition. But forward, they were doing this 12 on, 12 off thing, which I was never very sure about. But again, there are different requirements. If you're on machinery watch keeping, the machines don't stop. So you've got to be paying attention all the time. So you shouldn't have something like a 12-hour watch. I think 4 hours is the maximum you're meant to have when you're watching live machinery, whereas forward, if you're not actually attacking the enemy, there might not be that much happening. You're looking at the charts, watching the depth gauge. So they would be slightly more relaxed. But certainly going back to my time in diesel boats, 2 hours on, 4 off was absolutely knackering. Because the 4 hours off weren't 4 hours off. I mean, there were 6 officers. We shared what we called the wardroom. Our bunks were round a little table, which was about the size of a card table. And during the so-called daylight hours, mind you, up in the northern latitudes, there's not a lot of daylight in the winter, but the upper bunks were down because they formed the back of your seats. So if you came off, say, the morning watch from 4 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock in the morning, the rest of the officers would be having breakfast. The backs of the bunks would be down. Your bunk might be down, and then after breakfast, there's maybe going to be something happening in the wardroom, like people doing their accounts, the captain have a meeting, whatever. Or you might go to action stations for an exercise or something like that. So in the so-called 4 hours off, you very rarely had anything like 4 hours off. So I think we were probably ticking along at about 3 hours sleep a day. And it was absolutely shattering. As I said in the book, I actually took with me a bottle of smelling salts because I was terrified of being found guilty of falling asleep on watch.
Wow. In your experience, what for the sailors in the nuclear plant, and so here we're talking about underway. What for you would be the ideal rotation? What in your experience is the best possible rotation for the nuclear propulsion sailors?
I think the 1 in 4 4-hour watches.
So 4 hours on and how many off?
In theory, you'd have 3 for 12 hours off.
So 4 on, 12 off.
Yeah, although generally speaking, the 12 off are not all 12 off. You'd other things to do. I mean, when you're watch keeping,
Sure.
it's like driving your car. You're actually at the wheel. You can't do anything else, but you might have a job. The maintenance schedule for the next maintenance period, or you're taking qualifying boards for some of the enlisted men who are actually moving up or qualifying to become watch keepers and things. There's so much to do when you're off watch, and then you've got to sleep and eat.
Sure.
But I think for 4 hours on, 12 off was probably right. And also from when I was a senior engineer, it kept you well in touch with the state of things back in the propulsion world.
I'm interested in your, long career as an officer, um, at different levels. So when you're a very junior officer, and then you have the experience of being a middle range officer and then a senior officer, what kinds of challenges, generally speaking, just in your experience, do young officers face? I think here I'm thinking of officers who, they would like to make the Navy a career. But it's competitive for the officers, I think, especially. It's difficult. And so, as you look back on your career and look back on what you experienced in others, what would you say are the key, or is a or one or two key challenges that junior officers face, that mid-level officers face, and that senior officers face?
For a sub-lieutenant, say, or a young lieutenant straight out of training school, I think the first anxiety, certainly, I can only speak personally in this, but my first anxiety was proving I was competent. The second challenge as a new boy around the block is interpersonal relationships. You've got to impress your immediate senior officer, and you got to impress the captain as well. So I think those are the two challenges. In my first submarine, which I had a difficult time, I described it in the book, my overriding fear was my competence. In fact, retrospectively, that was never a problem. I was perfectly competent, and I would say retrospectively, I did a good job. But I had a problem with the interpersonal relationships. The captain was a bit of a playboy type. He's a professional submariner, but he didn't seem to have any interest in me at all. In fact, he treated me almost as if I wasn't there, and I felt kind of, what's the word, undervalued. The first lieutenant, I think you call him the XO, the American submarines, he regarded me as an extra, kind of like an intern or something. He could give me jobs to do. I resented that because I'd been told I was head of department. So I was kind of fighting to try and, prove that I was more important than they thought. But, all the cards were against me because I hadn't qualified at sea, I was like any other beginner at sea. And then as it happened in that submarine, it's the only time it's ever happened that my fellow engineer, the mechanical engineer, I was the electrical engineer, was not a nice guy at all. He's the only guy I've never really got on with. He seemed to use me as an easy way to impress the captain by him knowing more than me, sort of thing. And captain was starting to refer to him for advice instead of me, which again, so these were all little personal battles one had to fight. And no doubt we all have these battles in our careers. Sometimes I was lucky, it was right in my first job, and I learned a lot from it. And I drew the conclusion at that early stage that if I'm going to go down, I'll go down on my own mistake, not go down on a mistake which has been forced on me by a senior person. And I called that into play a couple of times in later life. But some of my chums who seemed to get off to a much better start than I did from our same training class, they hit similar problems at different levels, when they were a commander in the Ministry of Defence, for example, where you've got a different set of challenges, but you've still got while you're dealing with human beings, you've got interpersonal challenges. Now, when you get slightly more senior, if you got up to being, when I was Commodore, the anxiety, the job was so completely different from being a young officer. I mean, when you're a ship's officer, your horizon is the ship's hull, really. But when I was Commodore in charge of the entire naval base, I found myself sandwiched between Ministry of Defence headquarters and my client customers, the submarines on the jetty, and I was trying to make sure that they got everything they needed and they could get to sea, and I was under pressure from on high, either to do things like getting to sea faster when actually I was worried about nuclear safety mistakes. So it's a different thing that was almost like intercorporate relationships rather than interpersonal. And at that level, of course, you're involved in political and public sensitivities in as much that, we had an anti-nuclear so-called peace camp on the gates of the base who were always trying to cause us embarrassment. And they were professional public relations people looking like hippies. And they would report to the press that there'd been some disaster in the base. Well, I couldn't just go to the press and say, poke off, bloody rubbish, cloud of no-gooders, ignore them. The anti-nuclear movement was very popular. And for some guy who could be depicted as some, militaristic guy in uniform trying to say that they were wrong and he was right, I mean, that's meat to the journalists. They'll be out to prove that this militaristic guy's the idiot. But also, because if I were to speak to the public about something which happened in the base, I'm not just speaking as Eric Thompson, I'm speaking as a representative of Her Majesty's government and the Royal Navy and the Ministry of Defence. So anything I said had really to be cleared politically before I could make any pronouncements. If I was putting out a press statement, it had to be cleared all the way up. Whereas people in the peace camp, they just went straight to the newspaper and said, oh, look, there's a submarine, there's a nuclear meltdown in the base. And I had that several times and it was rubbish. And the other thing was presiding over a large naval base. You're responsible for safety of a large organization over which you don't have a great deal of personal control. If you're the ship's engineer, you can go and look at a job, or you can, look at the paperwork involved or who's doing it. But when you've got several thousand people down there all doing different things, it's quite challenging to ensure that everyone is doing the right thing and playing it safe.
Does that get back to what you were talking about before? Just the need to be able to trust others, to be honest and to be reliable. I mean, it sounds like, although you've acquired a significant amount of authority as a Commodore, it sounds like you're also, though, in a position of really having to rely on others because, as a matter of fact, you're not able to personally manage all of these things. You really have to trust others to do their jobs.
Yeah, and what the way you handle that at the sort of higher level is you have probably captains, people at that level who would be responsible for safety or responsible for this. So you're kind of managing a team which is sitting on the surface of of the activity. You got to trust them to do the right thing. But if somebody comes to grief or decides to come up with a malicious complaint and they go to the press about it and that happens, you're the guy who's the titular head of the organization. So when they want a head to roll, it's your head they're looking for, not the guy one level down in whose area the problem might have happened. So it's a completely different game from being a ship's officer.
So when we look back to go back earlier in your career, when you're in command of the nuclear propulsion system, if I can use that phrase, um, aboard a submarine, was there a particular day, a particular moment, a particular episode that you remember as being especially challenging?
Oh yes, very much so, and it's the opening chapter of my book. Is we had a fairly major steam leak on deterrent patrol when it was a 10-week patrol, that one, and we were about 7 or 8 days into it, and we were getting bilge high level alarms in the reactor compartment. Well, there should be no water in the bilge in the reactor compartment, so that suggested either that the reactor was leaking, which is most unlikely, or that we had a steam leak, which is much more likely. And indeed we did. And that meant we would have to shut the reactor down, wait for 20 minutes, put a couple of technicians in, well, initially to see what the problem was. Turned out that we had a rather bad design characteristic. We had our main steam stop valves on top of the boilers inside the reactor compartment. They didn't do it in later classes, but in that class they did. And it was this big isolating valve on top of the boiler that was leaking. So we realized that immediately when we went in to have a look. The question was, what did we do about it? Because with a nuclear submarine, you've got a relatively small battery compared with a diesel submarine, which lives by its battery. Our battery was only really intended to tide us over if the reactor scrammed, and that takes, well, it scrams almost immediately, but if we wanted to go into the reactor compartment, we'd have to wait 20 minutes, then go in, see what the radiation levels were. You would have about 20 minutes time in there, and then you'd just start taking the reactor critical again, which would take about 20 minutes to go through that procedure. So you had about an hour, of which you only got 20 minutes inside the reactor compartment. And we ended up, I think we did something like 7 reactor compartment entries. So that's 7 reactor shutdowns on operational patrol on station. And so that was pretty testing. And by the grace of God, my fellow mechanical engineer officer and I got on very well. And he agreed that we needed to do something about it as soon as possible on the stitch in time principle, because high pressure steam will cut through steel eventually, so the longer we left it, the worse it would get. So we did that, and it was all done by very careful planning. It took about 36 hours, I think, to plan what we're going to do. And then we had to do this stop, start, all the while on operational patrol at 15 minutes notice to fire our missiles. And we managed to sort that out, and we fixed the steam leak. But I think all the stopping and starting the reactor had thermal effects, the metalwork expanding, contracting, expanding, contracting. And a day later, we had a fairly major steam leak in the manned compartments. And I happened to be both on watch at the time, and I happened to be the senior engineer as well. And so that was a moment of truth. And my first reaction was to shut the stop valves. I mean, it's like switching off the lights. There were two buttons behind me. I hit the starboard one first, and then I thought, well, there's a 50-50 chance I got it right first time. So I screamed into the intercom system, which side is the leak? And a young lad, 20-year-old lad down in the bilges who'd reported the leak, although we could hear it, but we didn't know weren't sure where the noise was coming from. He was down there, and he came up with this cry of leak in the TG room, turbo generator room. So I said, which side? And he came back and said, starboard side. And I thought, brilliant, I've pressed the right button. So I didn't press the port button, and that was that saved our bacon, because if I'd pressed both buttons, that would have automatically cut off all steam to the engines and the electrical generators, and it would have automatically shut the reactor down and automatically put it into emergency cooling, from which there is no recovery at sea. So we would have ended up basically having to surface, running a diesel engine just to keep the lights on, and sending for a tug. But we were in actually a top secret location at the time.
So you
And
could,
that was all a bit tense. And then I realized, having shut the starboard stop valve, I hadn't stopped the leak. And that immediately told me the leak was coming from the boiler side of the stop valve. And the only thing that we had that could leak that steam into man compartments, a drain line, which you only ever use in harbour for when you're about to warm up. You sort of drain down any water in the system. And that indeed had blown. So we dealt with that eventually. But it left us with the starboard loop of the reactor. The reactor has two primary loops, and they basically, through heat exchangers, heat the water in the boilers to give us the steam which we use for all the propulsion. We ended up without a starboard loop, without a starboard generator, and that meant without a starboard engine and a starboard electrical generator. So we're like a one-legged man, and we had something like another 9.5 weeks to go.
wow.
Anyway, so that was all very challenging, and the team worked as a team, and in that particular scenario, I had a very, very good captain who understood that we were dealing with it and doing all that needed to be done. So he wasn't one of these captains who's always phoning up every 5 minutes to say, how long is it going to take, and he just concentrated on surveying the ocean to make sure there's nobody else around and that sort of thing. So it was quite a stressful situation, but I didn't half feel good when we got back 10 weeks later and we'd managed to keep the patrol together. So me and my chief of the watch, I could disappear off to go and do rounds, wander around the spaces and see what's going on down at the coalface, and he would be in charge of the reactor plant while I'm out, and vice versa, and that sort of thing. And it's all very informal. I'm sure it's the same in the American Navy, but I was spending 8 hours a day back aft on watch in the reactor compartment. So I was not the reactor compartment, the maneuvering room, as it's called. I was the only officer there. I spent more time talking to my chief of the watch and the petty officer in charge of the switchboard, or the first class technician in charge of the reactor panel, or the leading mechanic who was working the throttles. The five of us. I was spending 8 hours a day with them. I was probably spending less time with my fellow officers because when I was forward, I was probably catching up on sleep or working on departmental admin. So the classic gap that we had in the Royal Navy between officers and what you'd call enlisted men, sort of don't get matey with the men sort of thing, familiarity breeds contempt. Doesn't really work in a nuclear submarine. And as an officer, you can't just shout at your chief of the watch, "Fix that reactor, chief." You say, "What the hell's gone wrong here, chief? What do you think?" And he'll say, "Well, I think it's that pump's not right or something." "Well, we better go and look at that, haven't we?" Sort of thing. It's all very essential, so to speak. Although ultimately the officer has the final say. It'd be a very foolish officer if he tried to override his technicians.
You say that mankind cannot afford to ignore nuclear power. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'd always thought when I was on patrol in a submarine, we had our envelope of air. That was it, our atmosphere. And one of my jobs, of course, was to make sure we're keeping the right balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide and take out the other toxins as well. And we did that by running a thing called an electrolyzer, which generated oxygen out of the sea. And we took out carbon dioxide with some machines we called carbon dioxide scrubbers. So we were continuously operating atmosphere control. And we could only do that because it was a nuclear power plant. Couldn't really do it in a diesel submarine. In a diesel submarine, you basically change your air by going up to periscope depth and running the engines, and it sucked in, fresh air. And then I thought of planet Earth. Planet Earth is a bit like a submarine on patrol in the universe. It's got a finite atmosphere around it. And there's something like 4 or 5 billion human beings polluting that atmosphere day and daily in every way through, motor car exhausts, through power station exhausts, you name it, and cattle as well, passing their methane gas out. But you will never be able to correct an excess of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere using carbon-fueled power, because carbon-fueled power is actually causing the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So I had this vision of, one day we will be building nuclear power stations, not to keep the lights on, not to power people's iPads or whatever, but to actually run carbon dioxide scrubbers to take the carbon dioxide out of the Earth's atmosphere. You can only do that with nuclear power. Well, you could arguably with tidal power or wind generators, but that's such a level down. I mean, the concentration of power you can get out of a nuclear power plant is a different order. And whilst it's a good idea to have wind generators and things, that can't be the only solution. You need, in my opinion, you need a base load of nuclear power, and you can supplement it with wind generators or tidal barrages. But anyway, you will never clean the atmosphere with hydrocarbon-driven machinery.
Do you think that this is one of the services that naval nuclear propulsion programs bring to their countries, not only, in keeping the Navy going, keeping the subs going, keeping the nuclear powered carriers going, but also training people who, after their time in the Navy, are then qualified to go into the nuclear field and work in these plants. I mean, there's news about large corporations now that want to open nuclear power plants. Sounds to me like you think nuclear power is the wave of the future. And so it sounds to me like nuclear propulsion programs are providing this kind of unintended service of making available to the world people who are capable of doing this work.
The French, you got to admire them actually. They have stuck with nuclear and they've got something like 50 nuclear power stations. Britain, which is actually the first country to build a commercial or civilian nuclear power station, it was so political in this country, we had virtually killed the program. And we weren't going to build any more nuclear power stations. Then it was decided that now we actually needed nuclear power stations again. So we're having to buy French designs and we're using Chinese money to build nuclear power stations on the grand scale. But in parallel with that, and this ties in with what you're saying, Rolls-Royce, who are the design authority for our submarine nuclear reactors, they've got considerable nuclear design experience. I mean, I'm going right back to probably the late 1950s. Let's say 1950 for easy arithmetic. So that's 75 years ago. They've been involved in designing the nuclear cores and systems for our British submarines, based on the original American design, but quite separately developed since. They're now promoting, and I think it's got government approval, what are called small modular reactors. And this is the thing that I think people like Google are wanting. Small is a fairly relative term, I think. They're pretty large compared with the submarine, but you could have them in umpteen places around the country. Not having these mega, massive concrete things which we have at the moment for nuclear power stations. They would be much more factory size, I think. And I'm not sure what sort of power output they're targeting. But I think, as you say, the people like Google and others, I think in Google's case in America, they fear that the American public power supply system won't be able to provide them with the power they need to run AI. I mean, can't quite get my mind around why AI with a bundle of computers in a big warehouse can demand so much power, but apparently it does. So I think they're looking after their own interests by saying, "Oh, we've got to generate our own power if we're going to run AI." And for some reason, they've decided to go for, I think, what you might call mini nuclear reactors. But as I say, mini is a relative term. They're not as small as a nuclear submarine.